Hello, guys and gals, me Mutahar, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm a little worried for the future of one of my favorite RPGs in history. Now, ladies and gentlemen, EA Games, I think, is a pretty cooked entity. I think it's pretty fried at this point. I think Electronic Arts doesn't have too much long left. Now, look, I know that I said Battlefield 6 is pretty good, and I genuinely have been enjoying my time. But it does not detract away from the fact that, yes, EA was a bought-out entity. Now, how do we start this video off, ladies and gentlemen? To give you a reminder, last month, PIF, Silver Lake, and Affinity Partners, led by Jared Kushner, one of the main partners, bought EA for $55 billion. Now, it wasn't just $55 billion, it was a $55 billion leveraged buyout. Which basically means, for the understanding, is that a large portion of the purchase was actually acquired, not with equity, but I believe putting the company's assets and the future cash flow as collateral for a debt. Now, because of such a leveraged buyout, it was something around $20 billion. They got a loan as part of this buyout from like JP Morgan. And so all technical and financial nerdiness aside, that basically means EA has to be making so much fucking money going into the fourth. They have to be breaking record after record after record. So obviously for somebody that's interested in single player games like me, these tend to do, I think, pretty well. Like Dead Space Remake, even if it was a remake, I thought it was a pretty good EA game. Turns out it wasn't that great because Dead Space 2, from what I understand, never really got its remake materialized. In fact, Dead Space as a single-player franchise is deader than Elvis, okay? It's not existent. Now, EA released years ago Mass Effect Legendary Edition, one of my favorite video games. I think, if anything, it's the best way to play Mass Effect. Like, just if you're totally lazy, you don't want to go through modding anything, you just want to have every bit of DLC Sans Pinnacle Station available, just put in a disc, download it on Steam or something, and just play through Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3. One of the best sets of single-player RPGs ever imaginable. You know, it's like perfect evolution over Knights of the Old Republic, just an absolute showcase from the guys and gals over at BioWare, okay? Nowadays, Mass Effect isn't worth shit, okay? They have remade this game years ago. There's not a peep about anything Mass Effect 5 related, and we all know how amazing Mass Effect Andromeda was at launch and just how much of a lasting legacy it left. Now, the thing about this is, the reason I'm mentioning it, ladies and gentlemen, is yesterday something mind-blowing had occurred. EA Games announces a strategic partnership with Stability AI. Oh boy, oh wowie. So in collaboration with Electronic Arts, we're exploring new ways to add the value of generative AI to creative workflows to open new doors for rapid prototyping and visual storytelling, enabling artists and developers to imagine, visualize, and refine game experiences faster and at a larger scale. So again, to explain more specifically what's going on, some of the first initiatives is accelerating the creation of PBR materials, which make possible to generate 2D textures while maintaining true color and light accuracy. So they gave an actual example of how this is going to be used to, I guess, cut down on developer time and bloat and whatnot. Now, the reason I kind of mention this connection is it's not good. You know, a lot of artists, a lot of people in the industry will tell you that, you know, this is something that ultimately is designed to cut down on jobs. Okay, that's the first and most important. Remember, when I told you the leverage buyout that EA had, the important part for them was to make money. Now, if you're some bean counter with no connection to video games or no understanding of just how important this stuff is to the gamers and the people that make video games, for them, the AI shit is amazing, you know? Like, fucking get rid of, like, 300, 400 employees who are developing the video game, you know, people who are writing the fucking code, drawing the fucking experiences, you know, texturing the goddamn experience, fucking crafting the cutscenes, writing the stories. Yeah, let's just start getting rid of all that, chop it out, and then replace it with Gen AI experiences. You know, this is not something that makes the fucking developer happy because they know the moment these tools get introduced, their job security is effectively non-existent. And gamers hate this because it's so easy to identify human created art and then the fucking generic slop that gets sludged out. People were not light when it came to Call of Duty using this kind of shit for things like calling cards or anything at the time. It was pure laziness, and it showed that for even a game that is making gangbuster amounts of money, okay, these companies will always find a way to reduce the amount of money they spend just to maximize returns. And why wouldn't they? It's a fucking business. Of course it is. Now, obviously, look, the thing about the AI stuff that really gets me here is that, again, when I think about it in video game sense, I feel like I'm going crazy trying to constantly explain why this stuff isn't that great. Now, I'm not an AI hater, okay? I think for a lot of people that are, independent video game developers, people that are just making a game on their own, I think the tools can kind of be awesome for prototyping, for especially learning, right? Like the barrier of video game entry, I would say the barrier of software development has dropped to absolute lows. Nowadays, anybody that has no idea how to program anything or do whatever, they can use artificial intelligence as a great teaching method, something to help them write code with. Probably shouldn't exclusively write code with AI, but I think it's always an amazing tool when you can just sit there, have an AI sort of write out a code or maybe fix some of your code. It's a cool assistive tool to have. But obviously for companies like this, where efficiency and making money is sort of the intended goal, they don't really give a shit about the value that the stuff adds, other than the fact that they can slice down, say, 3 programmers and just replace it with one person who's working alongside Microsoft Copilot. Now, granted, that code that is written by just one person and tons of AI may not be of same or good quality as, 3 actual programmers, but the fuck does EA care? For them, as long as they can shit out another live service, which you can imagine more of these are going to be coming out, like there's going to be a lot more monetization of FIFA, or whatever sports game that they're working on. I don't even think FIFA is entirely EA. Actually, no, I think it is. But again, you've also got, the future of other live services like Battlefield that I'm a little bit worried about, because even though I said it has good bones, I can easily see EA Games putting in almost nothing but the minimal amount of effort to slop out a bunch of maps, to maybe use the Gen AI to create more dog shit looking camouflages, because I'm gonna be real, whatever the fuck came into the base copy of that game isn't entirely amazing, even from a realistic military perspective. But that's nor here nor there, okay? The future of this company is more exclusively put into live service solutions. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. Games like Mass Effect Legendary Edition, I believe, sold pretty decently. I think it actually beat EA's expectations, proving that it wasn't entirely some dead franchise. And the thing about it is, there was a quote the other day that came from the former developer on Starfield. So I want to just read this entire quote out, because I really do want to provide a big chunk of context, because it really leads to the next big point of my video. So systems designer Bruce Nesmith says, "I think it's a good game. I don't think it's the same caliber as the other two, Fallout or Skyrim, or Elder Scrolls rather, but I think it's a good game. I worked on it, I'm proud of the work I did, and I'm proud of the people that worked on it." So again, it's a pretty boilerplate quote, like he's proud of the game. He thinks it's a good game. I don't think he's gonna sit there and say, yeah, the game I worked on and poured my heart and soul into, yeah, that game's dog shit. But then he says something like this. He leans towards procedural generation as the game's biggest problem. "I'm an enormous space fan. I'm an amateur astronomer. I'm up on all that stuff. A lot of the work I did on Starfield was on the astronomical data. But space is inherently boring. It's literally described as nothingness. So moving throughout that isn't where the excitement is, in my opinion. But when the planets start to feel very samey, and you don't start to feel the excitement on the planets, that's to me where it falls apart. I was also disappointed when pretty much the only serious enemy you fought were people. There's a lot of cool alien creatures, but there's like wolves, but they're like the wolves in Skyrim. They're just there. They don't contribute. You don't have the variety of serious opponents that the story generators." So it's a good point that he's making, and the reason I wanted to play out this whole quote is because I really feel like for AAA gaming, rather, right? Not the indie gaming. I think indie gaming is probably the strongest it's ever been. I think AA gaming, games like Expedition 33, these are all standout, amazing hits. But when it comes to the AAA stuff that companies like EA, Ubisoft, Take-Two, a lot of these companies grit their teeth on, the big games of the year. Back in the day when E3 was a thing, It really was like, people saw a bunch of indie stuff, but you were kind of looking for the next Assassin's Creed, the next Mass Effect, the next fucking, Elder Scrolls, God, whenever those released in like a normal fashion. But for something like Mass Effect, right? When Mass Effect 1 dropped, back in 2007, it's kind of unheard of now to think that Mass Effect 1, 2, 3, an entire trilogy can be released basically on one console generation. Now it's like, hey man, Final Fantasy VII is a great example. FF7 Remake gets released on PS4. FF7 Remake Part 2 comes out on PS5. And there might even be a chance that the last part of that might still be a PS5/PlayStation 6 game. You know what I mean? Like, game development is so expensive and bloated and time consuming that at this point you are literally just waiting like years, sometimes several years between game releases. And even then, it's so expensive to make that unless a game sells an insane amount, there's never a chance that there's a sequel down the road or anything. So usually you have these new IPs that come out, they probably have some cool mechanic, and then because I guess the bean counters didn't consider them to be like overnight successes, they're basically thrown out of rotation before they even get a chance. But to go back to that Starfield quote, right? Nothing is more stronger. So using Mass Effect as an example, if you load up the first Mass Effect, and this is back in 2007, it was a game that really pushed, I would say, visuals at the time, like just seeing characters talk and the cutscenes presented in a cinematic manner. It was genuinely mind-boggling. You went beyond just using dialogue boxes. You were actually having real communications. It felt like you were watching a movie that you really were interacting with. It was a proper choose-your-own-adventure book at that high-definition level. But of course, when it came to the gameplay, right, one of the sore points of Mass Effect 1 was something called like Uncharted Worlds. So basically they would have like 4 or 5 main quests, and then every side quest was basically you would go into your galaxy map where every system, and there was maybe like 8 or 9 systems in the game, these 9 systems that you would go to would have like a bunch of planets within them. And so generally, most of those planets were planets you could just like load up in your galaxy view and see like them slightly closer. You might be able to survey 1 or 2 just to get like an extra resource, but there was always one planet that you could land on. And I remember at the time, this is supposed to be a pretty big feature, right? You could like land on your planet, you fly in, you see your fucking little tiny rover go from above, down, land on it. And the planet was boring, okay? It was literally just a square map that you could drive around. There's some hills here and there. Somebody fucked around with the map editor a little bit. And they would sometimes have these like random scattered points of interest. So sometimes it would be like a corpse you would find on the ground, some resource that you would do like a little mini game on. And sometimes on every single planet would be like one building that you would go to. And the building would be filled with enemies or just maybe another NPC you have to talk to. But these buildings were always just the same building with a slightly different prefab, right? And it became pretty evident in the first hour of the game that if this was the rest of the side content, yeah, it was pretty boring shit. And it's crazy to think that literally decades later when Starfield dropped, the same problem occurred. So like the actual designer said, it was true, right? Like this is where the game development had led to. The same square map, the same few landmarks spotted in the map that are randomly placed, and those landmarks themselves being just the same 4 or 5 different prefabs. So when you play these massive open world space games or these open space experiences, your first 2 hours might be kind of like awe-inspiring, but then extrapolating that to the next 30, 35 hours of meaningless side content, yeah, you can imagine why games like Starfield are best left unfinished. And that's the problem that I have with like the game industry too, right? Like, especially when you look at AAA stuff. When I was a kid, seeing games evolve was huge. But now it's almost like, hey, listen, if I'm doing the same thing verbatim that I'm doing back in 2007 with, yes, prettier graphics, does that necessarily mean gaming is getting better? Or does the industry completely forget what makes a good game? Playing something like Mass Effect again, I realized that playing a game for like 20, 25 hours, it doesn't need to be a massive open world. It doesn't even need to be a massive universe for me to explore. It just needs to be a good 20, 25 hour experience. Okay, I don't understand this addiction for the industry where every single game experience you need to have has to be something that needs hundreds of hours of gameplay. There's a reason why I haven't finished games like Assassin's Creed Shadows, is because after 15 hours, I know that the next 60 is going to be as boring and monotonous. In fact, more so than I thought. So it doesn't matter how shiny the graphics get, the massive worlds, the massive game times these people want to put onto you is the issue. And again, we're not even touching upon the rampant amount of monetization. For EA, to look at games like this going into the future, it makes me worry for like what the future of Mass Effect could be, right? For them, if they even choose to revive Mass Effect as a franchise, I almost wonder like, is it going to be like some dog shit live service where we're all like flying around a shared universe together? Or are they going to look at games like Starfield and think, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Let's take the galaxy map and make sure every planet is landable. It's all procedurally generated dog shit, where, 20 hours of the experience is actually hopefully fun, but the other 80 hours you have to deal with because you have to grind or do whatever in the single player experience, that's the shit that's going to drive you insane and up the wall. And I feel like instead of realizing that maybe not having boring, meaningless gameplay is sort of the play to have. Having 20, 25 hours of a handcrafted experience is not only going to be cheaper for you to develop and distribute, because again, if you don't have to have a game that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to develop, your sales targets should therefore be lower, right? You should therefore acquire less copies to sell to people in order to make a hefty profit, even on a single player game. But these companies don't fucking get it. EA would look at that and think, no, we can use the generative AI shit that we just partnered with and make sure 400, 500 planets in the Mass Effect universe have some maybe, extra 2 flavor text to it. Maybe the enemies look slightly different. It's just procedural generation, slightly more on crack. They want a No Man's Sky. Or think of it kind of like the No Man's Sky of a universe that's best values come with handcrafted natures to it.
But obviously for the guys over at EA, they would probably think, hey, hold on, the open world procedural generation problem can be addressed if the enemies that say that I'm fighting on screen right here, these operators just had individual names. Maybe they said a different line here and there. Maybe the procedural generation maybe altered the prefab a little bit. But ultimately, I think no matter what, people will be able to tell, especially when it comes to games, and especially when it comes to, again, the nature of these game worlds. People, the way that it's always billed is that this is going to generate like stories that are as good as the games that we're getting. And maybe that might be true if you're comparing it to games where quests, especially side quests, resemble that of something of a, early MMO. But this isn't that, okay? No matter what, it's not what gamers are mostly interested in, especially those that are interested in the single-player experiences. Again, it's cheaper for them to make a game in the scope of Knights of the Old Republic or even Mass Effect from the 360 era with the prettier graphics of today than to keep giving us constant hundreds of hours of the most monotonous, meaningless gameplay that's still intermixed with, 15, 20 hours of good gameplay. It really feels like the gaming, the production budgets have increased for really no real tangible artistic gain. It's just there for these companies so that they can say, hey, listen, here's 200 hours of gameplay. And now that we have generative AI, it's going to be easier to make and it's going to be better looking procedural generation. Still procedural at the end of the day. But hey, at least you have 600 worlds to go to instead of, I would rather, and this is my personal opinion, rather take 4 hub worlds than 400 AI-generated worlds that are going to get old after the 3rd visit, Same thing happened to Starfield. Same thing I would say would happen to any other massive scope space game or just massive single-player game in general. It doesn't even have to be a space game. It could be open-world crime games. It could be anything else in that vein.
So yeah, honestly, like looking at this whole partnership with EA, the only thing I really care about from their company is Mass Effect. And other than that, Need for Speed, just because I love driving cars around and it's like the only arcadey racing game. But other than that, man, Mass Effect, dog. I have been so excited. Like, I would say that out of all the RPGs that I was looking for, and I know that people are looking at BioWare's writing as dog shit these days. And look, games like Dragon Age Veilguard aren't doing much to help in that department. But maybe it's just copium. Maybe it's just like a soft spot for me. And the hopes that I have for one of my favorite space franchises. But reading the kind of shit that EA is doing now, the only thing that I can hope, guys, is please, God, please, for the love of God, can this thing be sold off? Can this entire franchise be sold? Can these single player things like Dead Space, can these studios, can these IPs be sold off to organizations that give a shit? You know, for a lot of game companies out there that are developing video games, there's such an emerging market of AA experiences, indie experiences, where we understand that it's not the AAA ray traced crazy experience, but at least I think that's where the innovation of games are happening. It's crazy to me when a game like Baldur's Gate 3 comes out and just does gangbuster numbers, earns so many awards, and the industry doesn't figure out that A, the single player experience really isn't dead, and B, if you want to make money, you can just make really good single player experiences. I doubt the team behind Expedition 33, even the business team, considered that game to be a failure. But that game alone shows more soul and more heart and more understanding of what I think gamers want, which is an actual evolution to gameplay. They don't just want prettier visuals and a nicer story, which is what Expedition 33 has. But they also want an expanse to the gameplay. They want this turn-based RPG experience that they grew up loving to be an evolution of what they have, you know, to take inspiration from other popular games and sort of infiltrate them into your own genre and then push your own genre. They want you to just take the best from gaming and keep making it better. They want you to play good gaming experiences. They don't want you to get games where the player plays them for like 10 hours and then companies like this think that the players are going to play for hundreds of hours thinking that they're going to be enamored with AI generated nonsense the whole fucking time, or just extrapolating these open boring worlds with just generative AI thinking that it's going to be the crutch that saves it. But then again, I'm thinking too positively in a way too. There's a good chance that Mass Effect isn't even in the fucking mind space for some of these like bean counters or some of these business types. I'm pretty sure going in forward, looking at, Battlefield, that might be something they keep, pretty clean just because it's so successful at the moment. But looking at sports games and looking at the future of live service shit, which it doesn't matter how many times those live services fail, I feel like it's the goddamn heroin dragon that these companies can't stop chasing. And if it's the one thing that'll crash the AAA industry, it's probably the heavy reliance on this, you know? I really do feel that for anybody that's losing their job, like the talented people that lose their jobs from EA, eventually do find places somewhere where they can at least develop those AA experiences, or maybe even like a good AAA experience somewhere else. Because let me tell you, man, EA isn't where it's at right now, and it won't be for a long time, really. I think, honestly, at this point, this might just be the actual death of EA. Like, it might just be a point where, it goes fine for a year or two, and then eventually one more studio falters, one more studio shutters, and then eventually piece by piece gets sold off until eventually the guys buying it just sell off whatever they need to recoup their losses and call it a day. Or they turn this into like some other pure mindless mobile gaming haven where they make a shit ton of money on people that literally do not give a shit about gaming in the slightest. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me know what you think in the comment section below. This is me, Mutahar, and if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. I am out.